Maeve Dempsey was used to a certain rhythm in her life, one that moved at the pace of deadlines, meetings, and high-stakes decisions. At 34, she had carved a niche for herself as one of the sharpest corporate lawyers in Manhattan. The long hours were exhausting, but the satisfaction of closing cases, securing deals, and earning the respect of her peers made it all worth it. Her husband, Ethan, on the other hand, had always been her anchor, a successful entrepreneur in the tech world. Ethan's business trips were frequent, but that had never been a problem. Their relationship, though occasionally strained by the distance his career created, had always felt secure. Until now. Maeve stared out the window of their apartment on the Upper West Side, her fingers drumming rhythmically on the glass. It was a Wednesday evening, and Ethan had once again called to say he would be late. Another business dinner with clients, he'd explained. She'd been understanding, after all. She was no stranger to the demands of work. But something in his tone had shifted. It was subtle, imperceptible, even, but it was there. The slight hesitation, the nervousness. Maeve had learned to trust her instincts. And tonight, they were screaming at her. Ethan had been acting strange for weeks. The late nights, the long stretches of silence when he did return from his trips, the subtle avoidance of eye contact. It wasn't just his tiredness from work, it was something else. But Maeve, ever the rational thinker, had chalked it up to his increasing workload. She had too many late nights of her own to consider the possibility of anything else. But then came the perfume. It was a faint scent, something floral, with a hint of musk, but it wasn't hers. The other day, as Maeve was getting into Ethan's car to head to dinner, she had caught the scent lingering on the seatbelt. For a moment, she had convinced herself it was nothing. But the more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. Ethan had never once mentioned a colleague or friend who wore perfume like that. So, Maeve did what she rarely did. She asked him. Ethan, she said softly as they sat at the dinner table in a quiet, dimly lit restaurant. I noticed something today, in your car. Is there someone else? Ethan's fork paused mid-air. His eyes met hers. His brow furrowed in confusion. What are you talking about? The perfume. Maeve continued, trying to keep her voice steady. It's not mine. For a long beat. He didn't respond. Then he gave a forced laugh. One that didn't quite reach his eyes. You're imagining things. It's probably just from someone at work. I don't know. Maybe one of the clients. Maeve wasn't convinced. But she let it go, for that night. At least. The following days were a blur. Ethan's strange behavior didn't subside. If anything, it intensified. He became irritable, snapping at Maeve when she asked about the details of his trip. He spent more time on his phone, more time out of the house. Maeve tried to ignore the feelings gnawing at her, but they persisted. The doubt, the uncertainty, it was like a shadow that followed her every step. Then, one evening, when she returned home after another long day at work, she found Ethan in the living room, rubbing his arms and scratching at his skin. He winced with every touch, his face pale and tight with discomfort. Ethan, what's going on? Maeve asked, her voice laced with concern. I'm fine, he muttered, but the discomfort in his voice was palpable. He turned away from her, trying to hide his body language. But Maeve was no fool. She moved closer, her eyes scanning his skin. There were patches of red, irritated spots, almost like a rash. You're not fine, she insisted. What happened? Are you sick? Ethan sighed and rubbed his temples. I think I caught something on the trip, he muttered. I'll be okay. Maeve's heart sank. There was a sharp edge to his words. And the way he was trying to downplay his symptoms made her nervous. She knew something wasn't right. Let me take you to the doctor, she said, her voice firm. I'm not taking any chances with this. At the clinic the next day, the doctor didn't take long to examine Ethan. He asked a few questions about his symptoms before moving to the most uncomfortable part of the appointment. Have you had any sexual activity recently? The doctor inquired, his tone professional but direct. Ethan's face turned a shade of crimson. No, he stammered, clearly caught off guard by the question. Maeve's eyes narrowed. Something about his response felt off. The doctor, undeterred, continued with his examination, then gave Ethan a prescription for some medication to ease the symptoms. I'm not sure what you've contracted, but the itching and rashes are consistent with an STD. You should get some tests done to rule out anything serious. The words hit Maeve like a punch to the gut. An STD. Her mind raced, the blood draining from her face. Ethan was sick. And now, the truth was staring her in the face. This wasn't just a bad cold or a bug from a work trip. There was something more to it. Maeve's chest tightened, and her voice caught in her throat. When they left the clinic, the tension between them was unbearable. Maeve couldn't bring herself to ask the question she was dying to know. How? Who? Why? She was afraid of the answer. But one thing was clear, the truth was no longer a distant possibility. It was right there, knocking on the door of their life. That evening, as they sat in their apartment, Maeve stared at Ethan, her mind whirling with possibilities. Finally, she broke the silence. Ethan, she said, her voice unsteady but determined. Tell me the truth. Ethan's face softened, but the guilt in his eyes was unmistakable. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words were slow to come. Maeve, I didn't mean for this to happen. What happened? Maeve whispered, almost afraid to hear the answer. And then, with a deep sigh, Ethan finally spoke the words that would shatter her world. I was with someone else. It wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a mistake. Maeve, I'm sorry. Maeve felt the ground beneath her feet tilt. The room seemed to spin as her world cracked open. Her chest constricted as she struggled to breathe. She had suspected something, but hearing it out loud was an entirely different kind of pain. Who? She asked, her voice breaking. Who is she? Ethan looked away, his face flushed with shame. He didn't want to say it, didn't want to see the devastation in her eyes. But Maeve needed the truth. Lauren, he whispered. Your assistant. Maeve's voice was a mix of disbelief and fury. You've been seeing her. For how long? Ethan's silence was answer enough. The betrayal hung in the air between them like a suffocating fog. The weight of the words settled over Maeve like a lead blanket. Her heart, once so full of trust, felt empty now, hollowed out by the brutal truth. She didn't know what to say, how to feel. Part of her wanted to scream, to throw something, to run away. But all she could do was sit there, numb, watching the man she thought she knew crumble in front of her. Ethan, for his part, seemed utterly defeated, as though the weight of his actions had finally hit him. But it was too late. Maeve's heart had already begun its slow, painful process of breaking. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Maeve whispered, more to herself than to him. And in that moment, she realized something. No matter how much she loved Ethan, no matter how much he begged for forgiveness, she might never be able to look at him the same way again. Maeve sat in stunned silence, her hands trembling as they rested in her lap. Ethan's confession still hung in the air like a cloud of smoke she couldn't escape. The words kept swirling in her mind. I was with someone else. She had known something was off for weeks now, but hearing him admit it was something else entirely. The tight knot in her chest grew heavier, suffocating her with every breath. She was staring at the man she had married, her husband, and all she could see now was a stranger. How had she missed it? How had he concealed something so significant from her for so long? Maeve. Ethan's voice cracked, a desperate plea in his tone. I swear, I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened. We were both lonely. I felt isolated with all the time I was spending away from you. Maeve's breath caught in her throat. Lonely, so. You found someone else, she spat, her voice barely containing the rage that had started to simmer within her. Someone close to you. Your assistant. Ethan. How long were you going to let me live in this lie? Ethan's eyes dropped to the floor, unable to meet her gaze. His shame was palpable, but it didn't matter. Maeve didn't care about his shame right now, she cared about the truth. How long? Maeve repeated, her voice low and steady, each word a sharp blade that cut through the fragile silence between them. Ethan hesitated. He ran a hand through his hair, his face pale. I don't know exactly, but it's been a while. Months. Maybe longer. It wasn't something I planned. Maeve. It just happened. Maeve shook her head. Her emotions a hurricane inside her. Anger. Disbelief. Heartbreak. All crashing together in a chaotic mess. How could he do this to her? He had always been the man she trusted. The one she believed in. And now, every ounce of that trust was gone. I gave up so much for you. Maeve whispered, her voice trembling. She couldn't stop the tears from welling up in her eyes. I sacrificed my career. My peace of mind, us. For this. For her. Maeve. Please, no. Don't, she cut him off. Her voice rising. Fierce. You don't get to justify this. I don't care how you feel or how lonely you were. I don't care about your reasons. What I care about is that you chose her over me. Over us. Ethan opened his mouth. But no words came out. His face contorted in anguish. His eyes pleading for forgiveness. But Maeve had no intention of offering it. Not yet. Not after everything. The room was suffocating. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. The weight of Ethan's betrayal pressing down. Unbearable. She stood up abruptly, pacing the room, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions swirling within her. I need space, she said through clenched teeth. I can't do this right now. I need to think. Ethan didn't move. He stayed seated, watching her with a mixture of guilt and helplessness. He knew there was nothing he could say to make this right. But Maeve didn't care about his remorse. She cared about her self-respect. About her dignity. He had stripped her of that in the blink of an eye. I'll sleep on the couch, Ethan said, finally breaking the silence. I'll give you time. Maeve. Just, please don't leave me. Please. The desperation in his voice only fueled the storm inside her. Don't worry, she said sharply. I'm not going anywhere, yet. Maeve hardly slept that night. The bed, once a symbol of warmth and intimacy, now felt alien to her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ethan and Lauren. The two of them. Together. Her thoughts circled back to the rash. The illness. The uncomfortable doctor's visit. Every piece of the puzzle began to fall into place. Ethan had lied to her for months. He had hidden a part of his life from her that she should have known. The pain of that revelation gnawed at her. But it wasn't just the affair itself. It was the fact that the man she had trusted with everything, her heart, her body, her future, had betrayed her. Had deceived her. How long had he been sleeping with her? Was it just sex? Or had there been more? The questions continued to haunt her as the night stretched on. She sat in the living room, staring blankly at the skyline outside, waiting for the morning light to bring some clarity. She needed answers. And she needed them now. The next day, Maeve took matters into her own hands. The conversation with Ethan had left too many loose ends. And she couldn't move forward without knowing everything. She needed the truth, all of it. She called Ethan's office and was connected to Lauren. The assistant sounded professional. Her tone chipper. But Maeve's gut told her that beneath the surface, Lauren was feeling something completely different. Lauren, Maeve said. Her voice smooth but firm. We need to talk. Can you meet me for coffee today? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sure. What time works for you? Now, Maeve said. Without hesitation. I'll text you the address. Don't keep me waiting. Maeve arrived at the small cafe in Tribeca 20 minutes later. She chose a corner booth, making sure she had a clear view of the door. Her heart raced in her chest as she waited for Lauren to arrive. Maeve had never met her face to face, but she had seen her name on Ethan's calendar, on emails, in his phone. Lauren was younger than Maeve, in her late 20s, tall with long, dark hair that framed her face in soft waves. She dressed with a certain carelessness that Maeve could see through: tight jeans, a leather jacket, expensive sneakers. She had all the right marks of someone trying too hard to look effortlessly cool. It didn't take long for Lauren to walk in, glancing around until her eyes locked on Maeve's. Maeve gave her a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Lauren hesitated before walking over to the table, sitting down across from her. Maeve, Lauren greeted, a little too brightly. I wasn't sure what this was about. But, I'm glad we could meet. I don't think you are. Maeve replied coolly. But we're here now. So let's get to it. You and Ethan. You've been seeing him for months. Haven't you? Lauren's face faltered. But only for a moment. She recovered quickly, folding her hands in front of her. I don't think it's any of your business what I do with Ethan, she said, her voice sharp. Oh. But it is, Maeve said, leaning forward, her voice low and calculated. You see, I'm the one who has to live with this. I'm the one who was lied to, deceived. So I think I deserve the truth. Lauren shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable, but Maeve could tell she was also nervous. The woman didn't look sorry, but there was something in her eyes, something that betrayed the image of confidence she was trying to project. I didn't plan it, Lauren said, her voice quiet now, almost apologetic. It just happened. Ethan and I were friends at first. I didn't want to hurt you. Maeve. I really didn't. You didn't want to hurt me? Maeve repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. You didn't want to hurt me. But you slept with my husband. Lauren didn't answer immediately, her face flushing with guilt. Maeve pressed on, determined to get the whole truth. How many times? She asked, her voice tight with emotion. How long has this been going on? Lauren's eyes shifted, unwilling to make eye contact. She didn't want to admit it, but she finally did. It started 6 months ago, after one of his trips. He said things weren't working out between you two, that you were too busy for him. I didn't, she broke off, a slight shudder running through her. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Maeve's heart thundered in her chest as the weight of Lauren's words sank in. 6 months. Ethan had been seeing her for 6 months. The betrayal wasn't just some fleeting affair, it was a relationship. Why did you do it? Maeve asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why him? Lauren paused, biting her lip before she spoke. His, charismatic, charming. I guess I just thought it would be something simple. Nothing serious. And now? Maeve pressed, her gaze unwavering. Lauren swallowed hard, her throat tight. Now, I realize. Lauren's eyes darted away from Maeve's piercing gaze, her fingers fidgeting with the rim of her coffee cup. It was clear she wasn't used to being confronted like this. It seemed as though, deep down, Lauren had expected Maeve to be oblivious, or perhaps resigned to her husband's behavior. But Maeve was neither naive nor willing to forgive. Not yet. And certainly not without answers. Now, I realize, Lauren began again, her voice cracking slightly. She looked back at Maeve, her lips trembling as she gathered her thoughts. Now, I realize it's wrong. What I did. What we did. She paused, as though unsure whether to continue or to walk away from the entire conversation. I guess. I thought it was just a phase. A fling. But it turned into something else. I was falling for him. Maeve's stomach turned at her words. She was falling for him. A wave of nausea swept through her as she struggled to keep her composure. All the pieces she had pieced together in the last few days now seemed to fit with a horrible, terrible precision. So, it wasn't just sex then? Maeve's voice was chillingly calm as she leaned back in her seat, surveying Lauren. She wanted to hear the confession. Wanted to hear exactly how deep Ethan's betrayal ran. Lauren's gaze dropped to the table. Her silence was the answer. Maeve took a breath, her voice dropping to a whisper, heavy with a quiet fury. You don't understand what you've done. You've taken something from me that I'll never get back. Do you have any idea what this has cost me? What he has cost me? Lauren shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes flickering back and forth between Maeve and her trembling hands. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. It seemed as though she wanted to apologize, but the weight of her actions kept her trapped in her own guilt. Did you ever think about me? Maeve asked, her voice tight. While you were in his arms, did you ever think about the wife he went home to every night? About the woman who trusted him completely, who thought she knew everything about him? Lauren's face flushed with shame, but she didn't answer. Maeve stood up abruptly, not waiting for Lauren to say anything more. Her heart was pounding now, every beat a painful reminder of her own vulnerability. She had trusted Ethan with everything, her love, her time, her dreams. And now, everything was slipping through her fingers. Take your apology and keep it, Maeve said, her voice shaking with emotion but firm. You can have him, Lauren. I'll let him go. But this will be the last time you and I ever speak. Lauren stood as well, her face pale and stricken with remorse. She opened her mouth to say something, but Maeve had already turned away and walked out of the cafe, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she left the woman who had once been a simple colleague of her husband's behind. Maeve was done with this chapter of her life. Back at her apartment, Maeve shut the door behind her with a soft click, leaning against it for a moment as she let out a long, shaky breath. She was exhausted, not physically, but emotionally, the kind of exhaustion that seeped into your bones, that didn't go away with a good night's sleep. Her apartment was quiet, too quiet. Ethan was on the couch, just as he'd promised. His face was pale, his expression a mixture of guilt and defeat. His eyes met Maeve's, but he didn't say anything. He had said everything he could say. His excuses, his pleas, nothing had changed. Nothing could fix what he had done. Maeve didn't know what to say either. She didn't want to speak, didn't want to hear anything he had to say anymore. She walked past him, heading toward the kitchen, not sparing him a second glance. Ethan stood up slowly, as though he was unsure if he had the right to even approach her anymore. Maeve, I'm sorry. I know it's not enough. Maeve didn't look at him. She couldn't. You're sorry, she repeated flatly, her voice barely audible. That's it? That's all you have to say? After everything? Ethan took a tentative step forward, as if he wanted to reach out to her but wasn't sure if she would let him. Maeve, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I swear. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I know that. Maeve shook her head, still not meeting his gaze. I don't want to hear it. Ethan, I don't want your sorrows, your excuses, your justifications. This thing between us. It's over. She could feel her voice breaking, but she refused to let herself fall apart. Not now. Not when she needed to be strong. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes pleading with her. Please, Maeve, don't do this. I love you. I made a mistake. I'm begging you. She spun around then, her anger flaring up. And finally, she looked at him. Really looked at him. The pain evident in her eyes. Do you still love me? Because it sure as hell doesn't feel like it. It doesn't feel like love when you lie to me for months. When you betray me with someone I trusted. How is that love? Ethan? Her voice trembled. But she was done being patient. Done being understanding. She wasn't his wife anymore. Not in the way she had been. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but Maeve held up a hand to silence him. No. You don't get to fix this. Not with words. Not with apologies. This is it. Ethan. This is the end. She turned away from him, walking to the bedroom to pack a small overnight bag. She needed to leave. She needed space. She needed to feel like herself again. Without him constantly in her head. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't even care. All Maeve knew was that she couldn't stay there. Not with him. Not after everything. She drove, aimlessly, through the dark streets of Manhattan, not sure where her mind was taking her. She found herself at the edge of the city, staring out at the water, the skyline glittering in the distance. The weight in her chest had only grown heavier since she left, but she couldn't stop the overwhelming sense of loss that swamped her. Her entire world had crumbled, and she wasn't sure how to rebuild it. Her phone buzzed in her bag. It was a text from Claire, her best friend, Maeve. Where are you? I'm worried. Please come home. Maeve stared at the message, her heart heavy. She typed back a quick response, I'm fine. Just need some time alone. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, it was a call from her mother. She ignored it. She wasn't ready to talk to anyone yet. She needed time to process, to think. The days that followed were a blur. Maeve stayed with her parents for a while, trying to figure out what she wanted. The pain of Ethan's betrayal still felt fresh, like an open wound that wouldn't heal no matter how much time passed. She avoided answering his calls, not wanting to hear his voice, to hear the same empty apologies. He had broken her trust in a way that couldn't be fixed by words alone. She found herself at a crossroads, between the woman who had been deeply in love with her husband and the woman she was becoming, strong, independent, and unwilling to be a victim. Maeve needed to know if she was strong enough to forgive him, or strong enough to walk away. The choice was hers, but the more time passed, the more it seemed like a decision she couldn't make just yet. Because the truth was, she wasn't ready to face her future. And more importantly, she wasn't ready to face the man who had shattered everything she had ever believed in. The first few days after Maeve's confrontation with Ethan felt like a blur. She had left their apartment, their home, without a word, without looking back. For once, she didn't care about the perfectly polished furniture, the art on the walls, or the cozy space that had once felt so intimate. It all seemed hollow now. She didn't know who the man was who had lived in that apartment with her, or who she was in the life they had shared together. For the first time in years, Maeve truly felt alone. She had stayed with her parents in their quiet Upper East Side townhouse, not wanting to face the reality of her broken marriage. The comfort of her mother's gentle words and her father's stoic presence were familiar, but they weren't enough to fill the gaping hole Ethan had left in her heart. The pity in their eyes didn't help either. They didn't know what to say to their daughter. What words could soothe the pain of betrayal? Nothing could fix this, and nothing could bring back the trust she had once had in Ethan. Maeve's mother, Grace, had been relentless in her attempts to offer solace. "Maeve, honey, you need to focus on healing," she'd said over breakfast one morning, her voice soft and concerned. "You deserve someone who will treat you right. Don't let this man control your future. Okay? He's already taken enough from you." But Maeve didn't feel like healing. Healing felt like a distant dream, something that might take years to achieve. She wasn't sure if she'd ever feel like herself again. And the thought of forgiving Ethan seemed as impossible as the idea of forgetting what had happened. But what about moving forward? The question had been on her mind constantly, echoing through every conversation, every text from Claire, every phone call from her mother. She had tried to avoid answering it, but eventually, it became clear that the choice wasn't hers to make. Not yet. Ethan was calling. Every day. Sometimes twice a day. But Maeve hadn't picked up a single one. It wasn't until the third day that Ethan finally gave her the space she needed. And the silence from his end felt like a relief. He'd sent her a message that morning: "I love you. Maeve, I can't explain it all right now, but I will fight for you. Please, when you're ready, let's talk." She'd stared at the message for longer than she cared to admit, her heart torn between the anger she felt and the faint, lingering hope she still had for their marriage. Could she forgive him? Could she really let him back in? The anger was easier to hold on to. It was sharp, a blade she could grasp tightly to protect herself from further damage. But the hope was fragile, like glass. The more she held onto it, the more it seemed to slip through her fingers. Her mother had suggested therapy. "I think it's time you saw someone, Maeve. It might help to talk to someone who's neutral, someone who can guide you through all of this." But Maeve wasn't ready for that. She wasn't ready to process the pain with a stranger, to try to understand what had happened in their marriage. The thought of opening up to someone else felt too much like betrayal in itself. And so, she spent most of her days pacing the townhouse, staring out at the skyline, and trying to ignore the weight of Ethan's absence. Maeve hadn't seen Ethan in nearly a week when he showed up at her parents' house. She'd been sitting in the living room, reading an old case file, when the doorbell rang. She'd glanced up at the clock. 2:30 p.m. Who could that be? She wasn't expecting anyone. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should ignore it. But curiosity got the best of her. She walked to the door, opening it just a crack. And there he was. Ethan stood in the doorway, looking exhausted, his clothes rumpled, and his face pale with guilt. His usual self-confidence was gone, replaced by a man who seemed small, broken, and desperate. "I know you don't want to see me," he said quietly, his voice cracking. "But I had to come. I can't lose you. Maeve, not like this." Maeve stepped back, instinctively trying to shut the door. But his foot was already wedged between the frame and the door. Please, Ethan pleaded, his hand outstretched, palm open. Just, let me talk to you. One last time. We need to talk about this. She felt a pang of something, sorrow, sympathy, but she didn't let herself fall for it. She couldn't. Not anymore. But she also didn't want to feel like a prisoner in her own home. With a deep breath, Maeve stepped back and let him in. They sat in the living room, across from each other. The silence was thick, heavier than it had ever been before. Ethan fidgeted, looking down at his hands, then up at Maeve, unsure where to begin. I don't know how to do this, he said finally, his voice soft. I don't know how to fix what I broke. But I'm going to try. I need to fix this. Maeve stared at him, her expression unreadable. Ethan's words seemed rehearsed, like he had said them 100 times already. But this wasn't a speech for her. This was the moment where he had to prove he could stand by his words. Ethan, you can't fix this. Maeve's voice cracked, and she quickly cleared her throat, not wanting to show any sign of vulnerability. You can't undo what you did. You can't make me forget how you betrayed me, how you chose someone else over me, how you lied to me. Every single time you came home late, every single time you said you were working, you were with her. The anger was bubbling up again. But this time, it wasn't for Ethan. It was for herself. She was angry that she had let him get away with it. Angry that she had ignored all the warning signs, all the cracks in their relationship. She had been so focused on her career, on being the perfect wife, that she had missed the slow, painful destruction of the man she had once loved. I know, Ethan whispered, his voice hollow. I know I can't fix this, but I can be better. I can show you that I'm not that man. I will do anything to make things right. Maeve. Stop. Maeve snapped, her voice rising. Stop saying you'll change. Stop pretending that you can fix me, that you can fix us. Because you can't. You had your chance. Ethan. You had months, years, to be honest with me, to show me you were still the man I married. And you didn't. She stood up, pacing across the room. I'm not even mad at you anymore. Maeve continued, her voice quiet but firm. I'm just exhausted. I'm exhausted by your lies, by your excuses. I'm exhausted by the fact that you thought this was something you could hide forever. Ethan stood, moving closer to her. But Maeve held up her hand to stop him. She couldn't let him get close. Not now. Do you know what it feels like to find out your entire life has been a lie? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Do you know what it feels like to realize that the person you thought you knew, the person you loved, was living in a fantasy world, with someone else? I don't think you do. Ethan. She paused, her chest rising and falling with every breath. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. I don't know if I can ever trust you. Not after what you've done. Ethan's eyes welled up with tears, and he reached out to her again. Maeve. Please don't say that. I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I don't know what I was thinking. No. Maeve shook her head. You knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't care. The silence between them stretched long and heavy. And for the first time in weeks, Maeve felt the weight of the decision she had to make. The past days had been filled with noise, Ethan's apologies, her mother's concern, Claire's messages, but all of it had felt distant. Now, it was clear that the decision wasn't just about Ethan. It was about her. About who she was. And who she would become after all of this. Maybe we do need some space, she finally said, her voice low, distant. Maybe I need time to figure out what I need. And if that's without you, then I'll have to accept that. Ethan's face fell, his shoulders slumping with defeat. But Maeve didn't feel the wave of guilt she expected. Instead, she felt a strange sense of calm. I think that's for the best, she said softly. I'll let you know when I'm ready to talk. But right now, I just need to breathe. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing there, lost in the wreckage of what he had done. The days after Ethan's departure were the longest Maeve had experienced in recent memory. They stretched out like a void, filled with restless nights and endless hours of contemplation. The silence that had once been oppressive now felt strangely peaceful. She no longer had to brace herself for the sudden interruptions of his presence, his voice, his apologies, but the emptiness that still clung to her. Maeve had spent most of her days at her parents' house, aimlessly wandering between the rooms, unsure of what to do with herself. She was floating, disconnected from the life she once knew. For a while, she had thrown herself into her work, but even that felt futile. The usual confidence she exuded at the office was gone, replaced by a sense of disorientation. She hadn't been able to take a call without thinking about Ethan. She hadn't been able to speak to a colleague without the weight of the affair hanging in the back of her mind. Everyone seemed to notice the change in her, but no one knew why. It was as if she had suddenly become a stranger to herself. The pain was a constant companion. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization that her life, the one she had built with Ethan, had been an illusion. Every memory, every moment they had shared, was now tainted by the knowledge that he had been with someone else. It felt like she had been living in a house of cards, and one single gust of wind had sent it all tumbling down. But the hardest part wasn't the pain. Maeve realized. The hardest part was figuring out what came next. She had been avoiding her friends for days. Claire had been texting and calling, but Maeve didn't feel ready to talk to her. Not yet. She wasn't ready to explain everything. And more than that, she didn't want Claire's sympathy. Maeve didn't need to hear the words she knew were coming, "I'm so sorry," or "You deserve better." She already knew that. The truth was, Maeve wasn't sure what she deserved anymore. She didn't know who she was without Ethan, and she certainly didn't know what her future looked like. She had spent years building a life with him, putting all her hopes and dreams into their future together. But now, that future seemed as fractured as the glass shards of a broken mirror. It was the sound of the doorbell that jolted her from her thoughts. Maeve froze, unsure of what to do. She hadn't been expecting anyone, and the last thing she wanted was to deal with another well-meaning family member or friend. She walked cautiously to the door, her heart hammering in her chest. Who could it be? When she opened it, she found Claire standing there, her face a mixture of concern and determination. "I need to talk to you, Maeve," Claire said, her voice soft but urgent. "I'm not leaving until you do." Maeve hesitated. She wasn't in the mood for a heart-to-heart, but the sincerity in Claire's eyes made her step aside, allowing her into the house. Claire was one of the few people who truly understood Maeve's struggle. They had been friends for years. Through all the ups and downs of their personal and professional lives, Claire knew about Maeve's marriage to Ethan, knew about their plans for the future, and knew how much Maeve had sacrificed to make it work. But now, it seemed, Claire was here to make sure that Maeve didn't lose herself entirely. They sat in the living room, the silence between them almost as heavy as the one Maeve had been living with for days. Claire, as usual, was the first to speak. "Maeve, you can't keep doing this," Claire said, her tone gentle but firm. "You can't keep running from this. From him. You need to make a decision. You need to decide what you want. Because you're not going to find peace by staying in limbo." Maeve shook her head, her voice a little sharp. "You don't get it. I don't know what I want. I don't know who I am anymore. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my future, it's all gone." "I get it, Maeve," Claire replied softly, leaning forward in her seat. "I know you're hurting, but you're not going to heal by hiding from the truth. You need to face it, and you need to decide if Ethan is worth fighting for." Maeve exhaled sharply, her fingers curling into fists. "Fight for him? Are you kidding? After everything he's done? I don't even know who he is anymore." "Claire, I'm not saying it's easy," Claire said, her voice softening, "but I'm saying you need to think about what's best for you. Not him. Not anyone else. You." Maeve closed her eyes, letting the weight of Claire's words settle in. For the first time in days, she felt something resembling clarity. Maybe Claire was right. Maybe she needed to stop focusing on Ethan, on the betrayal, on the anger, and start thinking about what she wanted. But could she forgive him? Could she rebuild her life, her trust, After everything that had happened, you're right. Maeve finally said, her voice almost a whisper. I need to decide. But I don't know if I can. Maybe it's not about being able to. Claire said softly. Maybe it's about what you need. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You just need to start making a choice. That evening, Maeve found herself standing by the window, gazing out at the city lights. She was still torn between the desire to rebuild her life and the overwhelming weight of the betrayal. Every memory with Ethan felt like it had been tainted. Yet there was a part of her that missed him, that wanted to hold on to the life they had shared. As she stood there, lost in thought, her phone buzzed. It was another message from Ethan. Maeve, please, let's talk. I can't do this anymore. I need to see you. Please. One more chance. I'll do anything to make it right. She stared at the message, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to respond. She wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, Ethan could change, could make things right. But was it worth it? Could she trust him again? Maeve didn't reply right away. Instead, she let the silence linger. She wasn't ready to make that decision yet. She needed more time. But in the depths of her heart, she knew something was shifting. She wasn't sure if it was a moment of weakness or strength. But something inside her was beginning to open up to the possibility of forgiveness. The following days were a blur of emotions. Maeve started to reconnect with her friends and family, slowly starting to piece together the fragments of her life. She spent hours on the phone with Claire, discussing her options and weighing her choices. The clarity she had felt earlier was now mixed with doubt, and she wasn't sure which direction to go in. The weekend arrived, and Maeve found herself in the familiar place, her apartment, where everything had started. Ethan's things were still scattered around, his clothes in the closet, his books on the shelves. It all felt so strange, so foreign. And yet, she could still smell him, feel his presence in every corner. She hadn't planned to go through his things, but she found herself unable to resist the urge. She opened the closet and pulled out one of his shirts, his favorite one, the one he had worn on their first date. Tears filled her eyes as she clutched the fabric to her chest. Was this it? Was this the end? Before she could stop herself, she pulled out his phone, which had been left in the drawer. It was still unlocked. She knew she shouldn't look, but part of her needed to know, needed to understand what had really happened, what had driven him to make the choices he did. The texts were there. From Lauren. Dozens of them. Pictures. Sweet messages. Intimate conversations. All confirming what Maeve had already known. But this time, there were no excuses. No apologies. Just cold, hard evidence. She felt sick to her stomach. This was it. There was no going back. Maeve stood there, her hands trembling as she stared at the screen of Ethan's phone. The realization she had tried so desperately to avoid was now in her face, raw, unfiltered, undeniable. The messages from Lauren were like a slap across her already bruised heart. It wasn't just that he had cheated on her. It was the depth of the betrayal, the intimacy of it, the way Lauren had become someone Ethan had confided in, someone he had shared his fears, desires, and secrets with. The messages were not just casual exchanges, they were deep. It was clear they had spent months building a connection, one that Maeve had never known about, one that had slowly but steadily taken her place. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she felt an overwhelming sense of nausea rise in her chest. She wanted to throw the phone against the wall, to erase the evidence, to forget what she was seeing, but she couldn't look away. She couldn't unsee what had already been laid bare before her. The messages were there, one after another. I can't stop thinking about you. You're all I want right now. I've never felt this way before. And then, a picture. A candid photo of Ethan in a hotel room. Half-dressed, his hair ruffled, his eyes a mix of pleasure and exhaustion. It was a moment frozen in time, one that had been taken without Maeve's knowledge, without her consent. And there it was, the evidence of the life he had been living while she had been carrying on, believing in the sanctity of their marriage. Maeve's vision blurred as the tears began to fall, her grip tightening around the phone. The betrayal felt like a crushing weight on her chest. a heaviness that made it hard to breathe, let alone think clearly. How could he do this? She stumbled back and sank down onto the couch, clutching the phone in her lap. Her mind raced with questions, but there were no answers, just more pain, more confusion. It felt like hours had passed before Maeve could even think about moving again. The tears had dried, but the rawness of the moment still clung to her. She couldn't stay here. Not in the apartment that had once been hers and Ethan's. Not with his presence haunting every corner. She couldn't look at his clothes, his things, his possessions. It felt like she was surrounded by his lies. Like his betrayal had infiltrated every inch of her life. Maeve stood up, feeling an overwhelming sense of urgency. She needed to leave. She needed to be somewhere else. Anywhere but here. Her first instinct was to call Claire, but she hesitated. She didn't want to burden her friend with her pain. Claire had already been so supportive, so patient. Maeve didn't want to put her in the position of listening to her breakdown yet again. But then she remembered what Claire had said. She needed to make a decision. She couldn't stay in this limbo forever. Stuck between the past and the present. Between the man she had loved and the man who had destroyed her trust. The decision wasn't about whether she would ever forgive Ethan. Not yet. It was about whether she could ever find peace again. A few minutes later, Maeve found herself on the phone, dialing Ethan's number. She knew it was time to have the conversation that had been looming over them both. The conversation that would decide whether they had any chance of moving forward, or whether they were beyond repair. The phone rang, each tone like a drumbeat, echoing in her ears. Would he answer? He did. Maeve? Ethan's voice was tight, filled with uncertainty. It was the first time she had heard him like this, vulnerable, almost pleading. Maeve, please, I know you're hurting, but we need to talk. We need to talk about what happened, about everything. His words were like daggers to her heart, but she forced herself to stay calm, to hold it together for just a moment longer. I saw the messages. Ethan, Maeve said, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with an emotion he couldn't ignore. She wanted to say more, to tell him how much it hurt, to scream at him, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't bring herself to speak the raw truth of how betrayed she felt. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, Ethan spoke, his voice shaking. Maeve, please, no. Maeve interrupted. No more excuses. I saw everything. Ethan, I saw it all. She could hear him take a deep breath. It was clear he hadn't expected her to confront him like this. Not so directly. Not so coldly. But she wasn't cold. Not really. She was breaking. You lied to me for months. Ethan, you betrayed me. And the worst part is that you didn't even have the decency to be honest with me. Instead, you lied. And you kept going. And I let you. The anger inside her flared. And she found herself standing again, pacing back and forth as she spoke, trying to control the shaking in her hands. How could you do this? Why would you do this? I trusted you. I gave you everything. Ethan's voice was low, raw with emotion. I don't know. I don't have an answer for you. Maeve, I was lost. I made a terrible, horrible mistake. But I never stopped loving you. I never meant to hurt you. Maeve's chest tightened. The words were empty now. They meant nothing. She didn't want his apologies anymore. She didn't want the broken man who had ruined her life. I don't want to hear it. Ethan, not anymore. You had your chance. You had so many chances. But you chose her. You chose to lie to me. You chose to tear apart everything we had. She could feel the tears starting to rise again. But she held them back. She was done. This was the end. I think you need to leave, she said, her voice trembling. You need to go. You need to leave me alone. For good. There was silence on the other end. Maeve's heart pounded in her chest. The tension between them so thick that it felt like the room was closing in on her. Finally, Ethan spoke. His voice quieter now. Okay. I'll go. I'll leave you alone. But Maeve, I'm so sorry. For everything. I'll always be sorry. Maeve didn't answer him. She couldn't. The words were meaningless now. Just like the man who had spoken them. She hung up the phone. The following hours were a blur. Maeve moved through the motions of her day, trying to shake the heaviness in her chest. But she couldn't escape it. Ethan's words lingered in her mind, but they didn't have the power they once did. It was over. She felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Part of her wanted to run, to scream, to throw something and tear everything down. But another part of her, one she hadn't expected, felt a calmness settle in her chest. The pain was still there, but it no longer defined her. It no longer controlled her. As the evening wore on, Maeve sat on the couch, her thoughts racing. She didn't have the answers. She didn't know what came next. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was taking control of her life again. She wasn't going to wait for Ethan to fix everything. She wasn't going to let his betrayal determine her future. She was going to find her own way forward. The days following Maeve's final conversation with Ethan felt like an emotional rollercoaster, highs and lows, confusion and clarity, strength and weakness all tangled together in a messy, exhausting knot. She had expected the pain to be unbearable, to be something that would overwhelm her in waves. But it wasn't quite like that. It was still painful. Of course, her heart still ached. Her mind still raced with the images of Ethan and Lauren, the lies, the secrets. But there was also a strange sense of peace that she hadn't anticipated. A kind of quiet after the storm. She spent the next few days in a haze, trying to figure out what her next step should be. She had already made the decision to end things with Ethan, but there was still so much to process, so much to untangle. It wasn't just him she had to grieve, but the life they had built together, their shared memories, the plans they had for the future. Everything had been shattered in an instant. And yet, she felt lighter. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, a weight she hadn't even realized she had been carrying. Maeve wasn't sure what the future held, but she was beginning to feel like she could breathe again. She didn't immediately return to her job. The office could wait. She didn't want to go back to that place and pretend everything was normal when it clearly wasn't. She took a week off, spending her time in solitude, trying to put her thoughts in order. She was living in a haze of routines, morning coffee, afternoon walks in the park, evenings spent reading or binge-watching TV shows that required no emotional investment. The noise of the world had become unbearable, so she drowned it out as best she could. The first week was the hardest. She had moments where the anger surged up again, when she wanted to scream and throw things, when she wanted to pick up her phone and text Ethan and tell him how much he had ruined everything. But then she reminded herself, he was the past. He was the man who couldn't be trusted anymore. It wasn't easy, though. There were nights when the silence in her apartment felt suffocating, when she missed his touch or the sound of his voice. The good moments, the ones they had shared before everything fell apart, would occasionally flicker in her memory. And that was when the pain would hit hardest, like a sucker punch to the gut. But she wasn't going to let herself fall back into the trap of longing for what couldn't be. She had to move forward, and that meant making some real changes. It meant letting go of the past and starting fresh. It was Claire who finally convinced her to take a step forward. Maeve had spent the week avoiding her calls, but Claire had been persistent. On the fourth day of her self-imposed isolation, Claire showed up at her apartment unannounced. "I'm not going anywhere until you talk to me," Claire declared, her arms crossed, standing in the doorway. Maeve couldn't help but laugh despite herself. "You're relentless, aren't you?" "Hell, yeah," Claire responded with a grin. Stepping inside, "I'm also worried about you. You've been hiding away in here like a hermit. And I'm not going to let you do that." Maeve sighed, collapsing onto the couch. "I'm not hiding. I'm just figuring things out." Claire took a seat next to her. "And how's that working out for you?" "It's weird. I don't know, Claire. It's like I'm trying to live in two different realities. One where I'm this strong, independent woman who's got everything together, and another where I'm still emotionally wrecked and trying to heal from everything. From him." "Maeve," Claire said softly, placing a hand on her friend's arm, "you don't have to have it all figured out. Hell, no one does. You've been through something huge, and it's okay to take your time to heal. But you also can't hide away forever. Eventually, you have to step back into the world. Maeve looked up at her, feeling a spark of something, maybe hope. Maybe just the tiniest bit of motivation. Claire was right. Maeve had been hiding, afraid of facing the outside world, afraid of running into people who would ask about her and Ethan, afraid of being judged. "I'm just scared," Maeve admitted, her voice low. "I'm scared I'll never feel like myself again. I'm scared I'll always be that woman who was cheated on, the one who couldn't even keep her own marriage intact." "Listen to me," Claire said, her voice firm but warm. "You are not defined by what happened to you. You're defined by how you handle it. And yeah, it's gonna be hard. But you've survived worse. You can get through this, too." Maeve didn't answer right away, her thoughts spinning. Claire's words weren't new, they were things Maeve had heard before. From therapists, from books, from friends. But for some reason, this time, they stuck. She needed to hear them again. Needed to be reminded that she wasn't alone in this. The next day, Maeve made the decision to return to work. The thought of facing her colleagues made her stomach turn. But she knew it was the next step. She couldn't stay in limbo forever. Couldn't keep isolating herself. She needed to find her footing again. To prove to herself that she could rise from the wreckage. The office felt strange. The walls, the desks, the people, they all felt like remnants of a life she had left behind. But as Maeve stepped into the conference room for her first meeting back, she surprised herself. She wasn't the broken woman she had been a week ago. She was still Maeve, the woman who had built a successful career, who had been determined and confident, who had worked hard for everything she had. She wasn't going to let Ethan's betrayal define her. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Maeve felt a small spark of pride. It wasn't about her marriage anymore, it was about her. It was about what she had accomplished, what she still had yet to accomplish, and who she was becoming in the process. A few days later, Maeve found herself sitting in a quiet cafe, sipping her coffee, her laptop open in front of her. She had spent the morning catching up on emails and responding to work-related matters. But as she glanced around the cafe, she realized that the world had kept turning without her. She wasn't the only one who had suffered, who had felt heartbreak. Life continued, and it was up to her to decide how she would move forward. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see a message from Claire. "Dinner tonight. You, me, and a bottle of wine. We need to celebrate you getting back on your feet." Maeve smiled, her first real smile in days. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But she was moving forward, one step at a time. Later that evening, Maeve met Claire at a cozy little Italian restaurant, their favorite spot when they wanted to unwind and laugh. The bottle of wine came quickly, and they ordered a plate of garlic bread, the smell filling the air with comfort. As they sipped their wine, Claire raised her glass. "Here's to you, Maeve. To strength, to survival, and to knowing that the best is yet to come." Maeve clinked her glass with Claire's, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "To new beginnings," she said softly. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know where her life was heading. But at that moment, she felt something she hadn't in a long time, a sense of possibility. It wasn't about forgiving Ethan, or even forgetting what had happened. It was about reclaiming her own life. And for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was on the right path. The week after her return to work felt like a whirlwind, and Maeve was overwhelmed in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the weight of Ethan's betrayal that plagued her the most anymore, but the constant feeling of being out of sync with her old self. She was struggling to reconcile the woman she had been with the woman she was becoming. She had spent so many years building a life with Ethan, so many years thinking she had it all figured out. And now, it felt like she was a stranger to herself. There were moments when she couldn't remember who she used to be. Moments when her reflections seemed alien. As if the woman looking back at her was someone she didn't recognize. Was she the same Maeve who had married with a sense of certainty? Or had the betrayal fractured her into someone else? Someone stronger but also more guarded. Work, for the most part, offered a reprieve. At first, it had been difficult to settle back into her old routine. The office felt different. Everyone seemed to know something had shifted in her. But no one said a word. There was an unspoken understanding. A gentle distance. But it wasn't pity. It was respect for her space. Maeve found herself staying late more often than usual, throwing herself into projects. Anything that would distract her from the endless loop of thoughts that kept running in her mind. She started to focus on her own career goals again, things she had shelved in favor of her marriage. She had once dreamed of taking on a higher leadership role within the company. But those dreams had faded as she had prioritized Ethan. It was time to revive them. She also started reconnecting with other friends outside of Claire, friends she hadn't seen in a while because her life had been so consumed by her relationship. She had distanced herself from them during her marriage, not because of anything intentional, but because she had been too focused on Ethan and their future together. It was time to rebuild those connections, to remind herself of the woman she had been before. One afternoon, while Maeve was sitting in her office, staring at a project proposal, she heard a gentle knock on her door. She looked up to see one of her colleagues, Emily, standing there hesitantly. Emily was someone Maeve had always gotten along with, kind, straightforward, and never afraid to speak her mind. "Hey, Maeve, you got a minute?" Emily asked, her voice gentle but with a hint of concern. Maeve smiled faintly, waving her hand toward the chair across from her. "Of course. Come in." Emily took a seat, her expression unreadable, but Maeve could sense something was weighing on her mind. It wasn't unusual for colleagues to come in with work-related questions, but this felt different. There was a quiet empathy in Emily's gaze, as though she knew something Maeve hadn't shared with anyone. "I know we don't really talk much outside of work," Emily began, "but I just wanted to check in. I know it's been a rough few weeks for you, and I just want you to know, if you ever need someone to talk to or just anything, I'm here." Maeve blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected this, and for a moment, she felt a flush of warmth in her chest. It was so simple, yet so meaningful. Emily's kindness was like a balm to her bruised soul. "Thank you," Maeve said quietly, a lump rising in her throat. She hadn't expected anyone at work to acknowledge her pain. She had expected them to treat her with pity, with awkwardness, or to ignore it entirely. Emily's approach was refreshing. It was real. "I appreciate that. I'm doing okay, just taking things one day at a time." Emily nodded. "That's all you can do. I know you're a strong person, Maeve, but it's okay to lean on others, too. You don't have to do it all alone." Maeve smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in a while. "Thanks. I might take you up on that eventually." "Anytime," Emily said, standing to leave. She paused at the door. "And just so you know, I don't know all the details, but I'm really sorry about what happened with Ethan. I can't even imagine how hard that must be." Maeve nodded, her heart tightening. It was strange to hear someone acknowledge the depth of the hurt. Most people had been careful to avoid mentioning Ethan, but Emily's openness felt like a small, healing step. It reminded Maeve that the world hadn't stopped because of her pain. People still cared, and she still had a place in it. As the days passed, Maeve found herself slowly gaining momentum. She started to feel more like her old self, the one who had taken risks, who had been confident in her own abilities, who had dreams beyond just being a wife. She still had moments of doubt, when the grief would rear its head, when memories of Ethan would come flooding back, when she would question if she had done the right thing. But then, she would think about the future. Her future. A future without Ethan. And that thought, though still scary, also filled her with hope. One weekend, as the weather warmed up, Maeve made plans to visit her parents. It had been too long since she had seen them, and she realized she needed their comfort and guidance more than ever. She hadn't really talked to them about the details of her separation, not because she was hiding anything, but because she didn't want to burden them with the hurt. Her parents were old school, traditional, loving, and protective, and Maeve had always been their little girl. She was their pride and joy, and she didn't want to disappoint them. But as soon as she stepped through their front door, her mother pulled her into a tight embrace. "Oh, sweetheart," her mother whispered, I'm so sorry. I know this has been so hard on you. Maeve's throat tightened at the sound of her mother's voice, filled with so much concern. She had missed them more than she realized. She hadn't realized how much she needed the comfort of her parents, the safe haven they represented. I'm okay, Mom, Maeve said, pulling back and smiling weakly. I'm getting there. Her father, always the more reserved of the two, gave her a solemn but affectionate hug. We're here for you, Maeve. You don't have to go through this alone. Maeve felt a lump form in her throat. She had known, deep down, that her parents would be there for her. But hearing their words felt like an anchor in the storm. She was tired of fighting her battles alone. She needed to lean on her family, her friends, the people who had always loved her. That evening, Maeve and her parents sat around the dinner table, eating her mother's homemade lasagna. The food was comforting, but the conversations were even more so. Her mother spoke about her garden, about the new neighbors down the street, and her father shared a funny story about a recent trip to the hardware store. The banter was light, easy, and yet it felt like a balm for Maeve's soul. It was a reminder that life, despite everything, could still be simple. Later, as Maeve sat in the backyard with her mother, sipping tea under the stars, her mother spoke again, more seriously this time. Maeve, I know this is hard, and I know you're hurt, but I want you to remember something. You are stronger than you think, and you are worthy of being loved, truly loved. Never let anyone make you feel like you aren't. Maeve felt a tear slip down her cheek. She had never truly felt the depth of her mother's words until now. I know, Mom. I'm learning that. Every day. Her mother smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Maeve's face. Good. You'll heal. Sweetheart. It won't be easy, but you'll be okay. You're not alone. As Maeve drove home that night, she felt something inside her shift. The road ahead, though uncertain, was hers to navigate. She didn't know exactly where it would lead, but she was no longer afraid of the journey. She had people who loved her. She had strength that had been tested and proven. And she was learning, every day, to believe in her own worth. As she pulled into her apartment parking lot, Maeve took a deep breath. She was still healing, still processing everything. But for the first time in months, she felt like she was on the right path. A path that was all her own. The weeks following Maeve's decision to move on from Ethan passed in a blur of work, self-reflection, and quiet moments of profound change. Though the sadness lingered like a shadow she could not escape, something else had begun to grow within her, a quiet resolve. She wasn't who she used to be, but she was becoming someone new, someone stronger. The woman she had always been, buried under layers of fear and grief, was starting to re-emerge. Maeve hadn't anticipated that moving on from Ethan would be this hard. Everyone had warned her, time heals all wounds. But time didn't feel like it was healing her, it was simply allowing her to feel the depth of the wound. Every sharp edge, every jagged crack. She had thought that once she made the decision to let him go, it would be the beginning of her freedom. But in reality, it was just the first step. The healing process was messy, non-linear, and infinitely more complicated than she had imagined. It was 3 a.m. when Maeve sat upright in bed, her heart racing, a cold sweat coating her skin. The dream was still fresh, too vivid to shake off immediately. She had been in their old house, the one she and Ethan had bought together years ago. Walking through the hallway, the walls were adorned with photographs of their vacations, their weddings, their moments together. But as she walked through the familiar rooms, something was wrong. The photos weren't the same. They were pictures of Ethan, his smile wide, standing next to Lauren, his face alight with joy. Maeve had tried to scream, to reach out to him, but her voice didn't work. She couldn't even move. It felt as if she was trapped in a place she no longer recognized. She jolted out of bed, gasping for air, her pulse racing. Her hands were cold, trembling as she wrapped her arms around her body, trying to gather the shattered pieces of her mind. The lingering effects of her nightmare sat like a weight in her chest. But she forced herself to calm down. She needed to process this, not in the way she wanted, not in the explosive, angry way that felt easy, but in a way that would allow her to find some peace. She thought of the therapy session she'd had a few days ago. Her therapist, Dr. Collins, had told her something that Maeve hadn't quite been ready to hear until now. The memory is not the same as the reality. The dream wasn't real. The past, as painful and raw as it was, couldn't be altered. She couldn't undo the hurt Ethan had caused, and she couldn't keep living in a memory of him that no longer existed. But somehow, in the quiet of her apartment, at 3 a.m., it felt like she was drowning in that memory. The following morning, Maeve made an effort to do something different. She stepped out of her apartment, not for work, not for errands, but for herself. The weight of the past few weeks had been heavy, and it was time for her to find new space, physically, emotionally, and mentally. She had never been the type of person to let her grief consume her indefinitely. She knew how to push through difficult times, to put on a mask, to move forward with grace. But this was different. This wasn't just a setback. It was a complete fracture of everything she had known to be true about her life. Her marriage, her love, her shared future, all of it was gone in a matter of moments, shattered by betrayal. But she wasn't the type of person who would let the shattered pieces of her life define her. Maeve found herself at the edge of a park, one she hadn't visited in years. The park was quiet that morning, with only a few joggers and dog walkers scattered across the grass. The stillness was oddly calming, and she settled onto a bench beneath a willow tree, the long branches swaying gently in the breeze. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe. Her thoughts turned inward, and she realized that the most important step she needed to take was learning to forgive herself, not for Ethan's betrayal, but for the parts of herself she had ignored while living in that relationship. She had given so much of herself to Ethan, to their life together, that she had neglected the most important person in her world, herself. Maeve had always been independent in many ways, but in her marriage, she had merged so fully with Ethan that she had forgotten what it was like to be her own person, apart from him. And now, she had to rebuild that. It wasn't just about recovering from the betrayal. It was about rediscovering who she was. In the days that followed, Maeve began to intentionally put herself back into the world, not just as a woman recovering from heartbreak, but as Maeve, a woman with desires, goals, and a future of her own. She joined a local book club, something she had wanted to do for years but had always postponed because of Ethan. She signed up for a cooking class on the weekends, an indulgence in something purely for herself, where there were no expectations, no judgments, just learning for the joy of it. At work, Maeve took on new challenges. She asked her boss for a larger role in upcoming projects, volunteering to lead a team for an upcoming pitch. She knew it was time to take her career more seriously, to stop holding herself back, to move away from the shadows of the past. But as she stepped into this new version of herself, there were moments of doubt, small, fleeting moments, but they were there. Maeve had moments where she would catch a glimpse of herself in the mirror, and she would think, "Who am I becoming?" There were moments when she missed the companionship of a partner, the closeness that only a relationship could provide. But then, she would remember, "I am becoming me." Maeve's friendship with Claire continued to grow, but even Claire couldn't fully understand the pain Maeve was experiencing. She was doing her best to support Maeve through it, but Claire hadn't been through a betrayal of this magnitude. Still, Maeve appreciated her steadfast presence, her humor, and her unwavering loyalty. One night, after a particularly long week at work, Maeve and Claire sat in Claire's apartment, sipping wine and catching up on their lives. "So, how's the cooking class going?" Claire asked, leaning forward with a playful grin. Maeve laughed softly, swirling her wine in her glass. "It's fun. We made sushi last week, and I nearly cut my finger off trying to roll it, but the instructor said it was impressive for a first-timer." "Sounds dangerous," Claire teased. "Maybe you should just stick to something safer, like baking cookies." Maeve shook her head, a genuine smile forming on her lips. "No, I'm not going to do that. I want to keep pushing myself." There was a pause, and Maeve could feel Claire's eyes on her. She knew that Claire could see the change in her. And while she was proud of that change, there was still a fear of what it meant. "You know," Claire said, "I've never told you this, but I've always admired how strong you are. I mean, I've seen you go through a lot. But this takes a whole new level of strength." Maeve blinked, taken aback by the sincerity in Claire's voice. "I don't know if I'm strong, Claire. I think I'm just doing what I have to do. That's what makes you strong," Claire replied softly. "You're not just surviving, Maeve. You're rebuilding. From the ground up." Maeve's heart tightened. And for a moment, she felt a rush of emotion, something she hadn't expected. She wasn't just rebuilding her life in the aftermath of Ethan's betrayal, she was rediscovering her worth. As weeks passed, Maeve found herself falling into new rhythms. Her career was advancing. Her self-esteem was growing. And her social life, while still a bit tentative, was expanding. She wasn't in a rush to date anyone or to be in a relationship again. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that kind of commitment yet. And that was okay. She had time. One evening, as she walked home from a late work event, Maeve realized something profound. She was okay. More than okay. She was becoming whole again. For the first time since Ethan's betrayal, she felt like the future was hers to shape. No longer defined by her past. No longer anchored by the life she had once believed in. Maeve felt empowered. Her life was beginning again. And she was ready for whatever came next. Maeve had always believed in the idea of self-reliance. That one could be strong enough to weather any storm. But as she continued on this path of healing, she began to realize that strength wasn't about isolating yourself or pretending that everything was okay. It wasn't about putting on a brave face for the world or pretending that the pain didn't hurt. True strength, she was discovering, was about embracing vulnerability, about giving herself permission to feel everything, to acknowledge the depths of her hurt. And still, despite it all, choosing to move forward. It was an odd sensation to feel the weight of independence. Maeve had always prided herself on being self-sufficient. But now that she was truly alone, she realized just how much she had relied on Ethan over the years. It wasn't just the day-to-day practicalities of life that had tied her to him, but the emotional weight, the comfort of knowing someone else was there. The knowledge that there was someone who would always have her back, no matter what. Now, those feelings had been replaced with the stark reality of being on her own. There were nights when Maeve would lie awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, and wonder if she was really ready for the life ahead. If she was really ready to carry all of this on her own. There were moments when loneliness hit her like a tidal wave, overwhelming her senses, knocking her off balance. The silence of her apartment would become deafening, the emptiness pressing against her chest. But then, in those quiet moments, she would remind herself that she wasn't alone. Really, she had her friends, her family, her work, and most importantly, she had herself. She was learning to lean into that, to trust in her own ability to navigate whatever challenges life threw her way. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Maeve felt the first real crack in her newfound strength. She was sitting in the conference room at work, running through a presentation she was preparing for an upcoming pitch. The words on her laptop screen blurred together as her mind wandered, pulled back into the fog of memory. She remembered the first time she and Ethan had pitched a project like this together. They had been so excited, so full of ambition. Ethan's hands had been warm on hers as they had walked into the conference room together, ready to take on the world. But now, sitting alone at the head of the table, Maeve couldn't shake the sense of emptiness. The laughter that had once filled her home seemed so distant now. A memory from a past life. A sharp pang of doubt pierced her chest. Was she really strong enough to handle this? Was she really ready to take on this responsibility? Her thoughts spiraled, and she felt a brief, overwhelming urge to just step away, to call in sick and disappear for a few days, anything to avoid the weight of the expectations she was placing on herself. But then, just as quickly, she shook off the thought. She wasn't the type of person to give in to doubt. She was Maeve, strong, capable, and more than capable of handling whatever was thrown her way. She took a deep breath, steadied her hands, and went back to work. After a long day of meetings and emails, Maeve was exhausted. She had thrown herself into her work with everything she had. But the emotional toll of navigating the delicate balance between grief and progress was taking its toll. She met Claire for dinner at a small, cozy restaurant in the city. The familiar buzz of conversation and the clinking of silverware was a welcome distraction from the quiet storm of her thoughts. "All right. Spill it," Claire said, leaning across the table with a teasing smile. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Maeve laughed, but the sound was a little strained. "You know me too well," she said, stirring her glass of wine. I don't know. Sometimes, I feel like I'm doing okay. Like I'm getting stronger. But other times, I feel like I'm about to break." Claire's smile softened. "You're allowed to feel like that. You know, you've been through a lot. It's okay to have days where you're not okay. It doesn't mean you've failed or that you're weak. It means you're human." Maeve nodded, her throat tight. "I just don't know how to balance everything. I want to move on. I want to get my life back together. But sometimes it feels like I'm trying to fit into a life that doesn't belong to me anymore. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep pretending." "You're not pretending," Claire said firmly. "You're growing. And growing hurts. It's messy. It's uncomfortable. But you're doing it." Maeve took a deep breath, holding Claire's gaze. "I don't know who I am anymore. Claire. I thought I did. I thought I had it all figured out. But now, everything's different. I'm different. And sometimes I don't even know what to do with myself." Claire smiled gently. "You're allowed to be lost for a while. It's part of finding yourself again. And you don't have to do it alone. You've got me." The words settled over Maeve like a warm blanket. She hadn't realized just how much she needed to hear that. She wasn't alone. And even though the future was uncertain, she wasn't going to face it without the people who loved her by her side. Maeve's journey of self-discovery continued in the weeks that followed. She began to spend more time doing things that made her feel truly alive. She rediscovered her love for hiking, something she had done often when she was younger. On weekends, she would drive out to the mountains, walk for hours, and breathe in the crisp, fresh air. The solitude of the trails, the vastness of the landscape, allowed her to think, really think, about the woman she was becoming. One Saturday morning, as she reached the summit of a particularly challenging trail, Maeve stopped to take in the view. The sprawling valley below was bathed in the soft golden light of early morning, and the air was cool and still. She felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly connected to herself. There was no Ethan. There was no betrayal. There was only her. And she was strong. She was capable. One evening, while Maeve was at a local cafe working on some notes for an upcoming project, she had an unexpected encounter. A man approached her table, his features familiar, though she couldn't quite place him at first. "Maeve," he asked tentatively. "Maeve Sullivan?" She looked up, narrowing her eyes. "Yes, I'm Ryan. Ryan Spencer. We met a few years ago at an event at Ethan's company," he said, offering a friendly smile. Maeve's heart skipped a beat. Ethan's old colleague. She hadn't seen Ryan in ages. In fact, she had almost forgotten about him entirely. Ryan had been one of Ethan's business contacts. A charming man who had always been polite to her, though they hadn't interacted much beyond a few casual conversations at parties and events. "Oh, wow. Ryan, I didn't expect to see you here," Maeve said, trying to maintain a sense of composure. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Ryan said quickly, "but I saw you sitting here and thought I'd say hi. You look good. It's been a while." Maeve smiled, though it felt forced. "Yeah, it has been a while. How have you been?" They exchanged small talk for a few minutes, but Maeve couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this conversation. She had no idea what it was, whether it was the familiarity of Ryan's presence or the awkwardness of seeing someone from her past, but she found herself hesitant to talk too much. It felt too close to something she wasn't ready to confront. "Actually, Ryan," she said after a brief pause, "I've got to get going. It was nice catching up." Though Ryan's smile was understanding. "Of course. Maybe we'll run into each other again sometime. As Maeve left the cafe, she couldn't help but feel unsettled. Seeing someone from her past, someone who still knew her, even if only through the lens of her relationship with Ethan, was a reminder of how much had changed. But it also reminded her of how far she'd come. She wasn't that woman anymore, the woman who had defined herself by her marriage. She wasn't defined by anyone but herself. As Maeve walked out into the evening air, the sounds of the bustling city all around her, she felt the weight of her past lifting just a little more. She was still rebuilding, still finding herself, but she was moving forward. She was living, and she was finally starting to understand that she didn't need anyone else to define her. Maeve stood at the edge of the dock, watching the early morning sun stretch over the water. The lake was still, the surface shimmering with a soft, golden glow as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. The air was crisp, cool against her skin. She hadn't expected this retreat to be exactly what she needed, but here she was, feeling a peace she hadn't felt in months. The company retreat, held at a lakeside resort, had come at the perfect time. Maeve had been working tirelessly for weeks, juggling a growing workload, personal reflection, and the daily challenge of continuing her path of emotional recovery. The idea of escaping to a remote location for a few days had seemed both terrifying and necessary. She wasn't sure how she would feel surrounded by colleagues, some of whom were still unaware of her situation with Ethan. But as she stood on the dock in the quiet of the morning, Maeve realized it was the right decision. It wasn't just the quiet of nature that calmed her, it was the feeling of freedom. For the first time in months, she didn't feel defined by her past. She wasn't the wife left behind. She wasn't the woman who had been cheated on. She was just Maeve. And that felt like a revelation. The retreat was supposed to be an opportunity to recharge, to bond with co-workers, and to brainstorm ideas for the upcoming quarter. But Maeve couldn't escape the tension in the air. As the group gathered in the conference room for the first team building session, Maeve felt the sharp glances from a few of her colleagues. They knew something had changed in her, even if they didn't know the full story. And that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. She had spent too much time hiding behind a mask, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. She had tried to fit herself into the life she had once known, but she had learned the hard way that pretending wasn't healing. As she settled into her seat at the conference table, she was greeted by Emily, her colleague from the office who had been a quiet support in the past few months. Emily's smile was warm, genuine, but there was a slight sadness behind her eyes that Maeve couldn't ignore. "Hey, how are you doing?" Emily asked softly, her voice gentle, almost as if she were treading carefully around Maeve's emotions. Maeve forced a smile, but it was a real one this time. "I'm good. It's nice to get away for a bit. You know, just to clear my head. I'm glad you're here," Emily said. "I know it's been a tough year for you, and I just want you to know that I'm here for you. If you ever need to talk, or even just not talk." "I get it." Maeve's throat tightened. She hadn't realized how much she appreciated Emily's kindness. In her quieter moments, she had been feeling a bit disconnected from the world. She had pulled away from most people, unsure of where to turn. But Emily's steady presence was grounding. "Thanks, Emily. I really do appreciate it," Maeve replied. They settled into their seats as the meeting began. But Maeve couldn't help but feel the faint pull of anxiety. The retreat was meant to bring the team closer together. But as the hours passed and the icebreaker activities continued, Maeve found herself withdrawing even more. The forced small talk, the superficial conversations, it all felt so exhausting. She wasn't quite ready to re-enter that world fully, to interact with people who still looked at her with pity, or even worse, as though she was broken. It was exhausting pretending that everything was fine when, in reality, she was still piecing herself back together. Later that evening, Maeve took a walk along the shore after dinner, her mind racing with a jumble of thoughts. She needed to clear her head, to breathe in the cool night air and find some clarity. As she wandered away from the group, she felt her phone buzz in her pocket. It was Claire. Maeve smiled to herself before answering the call. "Hey, Claire," she said, trying to keep her voice light. But she knew Claire would hear the fatigue underneath. Maeve. Claire's voice came through the phone. Concerned but playful. I can hear the exhaustion in your voice. How's the retreat going? It's fine. Maeve replied. It's just, I don't know. You know, I'm still adjusting. The whole thing feels a little too corporate for me right now. The small talk. The forced bonding. I think I just want to be alone. Claire let out a laugh. Light but understanding. That sounds about right. You're not one to thrive in those forced situations. But, Maeve, you're not here to be the life of the party. You're here for you. So, don't try to force yourself into their box. If you need to step away for a bit, do it. It's okay. Maeve's chest relaxed as she leaned against a tree. The sounds of the retreat fading into the distance. Yeah. I guess I just feel out of place. Everyone's talking about their partners, their families, their lives. And here I am, still trying to figure out who I am without all of that. You are figuring it out, Claire said firmly, the tone of her voice turning serious. And you're doing it in your own time. Don't let anyone rush you. Maeve, you're allowed to take as long as you need. Maeve closed her eyes, her heart swelling with gratitude. Claire had always known how to put things in perspective. Always knew the right thing to say when Maeve was lost in her own self-doubt. Thanks, Claire. I really needed to hear that. I'm here for you. Always. Claire said softly. Now, go take some time for yourself. You're not in a rush to figure it all out. Life is a journey, not a race. Maeve let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She needed that reminder. She didn't have to have everything figured out right now. Okay. I'm going to try to get some sleep, Maeve said, her voice more relaxed than it had been in weeks. Good. Sleep tight. We'll talk soon. As Maeve ended the call, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for months. She wasn't broken. She wasn't lost. She was in the process of becoming someone new, someone stronger, and more self-aware than she had ever been. And that was enough. The following afternoon, as the retreat began winding down, Maeve found herself sitting in a quiet lounge area, nursing a coffee and reflecting on the weekend. The sessions had been draining, but the solitude had given her time to process her thoughts. She had learned more about her co-workers. Yes, but more importantly, she had learned something profound about herself. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard a voice calling her name. Maeve? Maeve Sullivan? Maeve turned to see Ryan Spencer walking toward her. The same man she had briefly met at the cafe a few weeks ago. He was smiling in that friendly, approachable way. But Maeve couldn't help but feel a small pang of discomfort at the unexpected encounter. Ryan? Maeve asked, trying to sound casual. What are you doing here? I'm actually part of the team building group, Ryan said with a grin. I didn't expect to see you here. Small world. Huh? Maeve's heart fluttered a little. She wasn't quite sure how to handle this. She hadn't expected to run into him again, especially not so soon after their last conversation. It wasn't that she had any ill will toward Ryan. He was always polite and well-mannered, but Maeve couldn't help but feel uneasy around anyone who had been connected to her past with Ethan. Yeah. It's funny, Maeve said with a tight smile. I wasn't planning on coming at all. But it's been good to get away for a while. Ryan nodded thoughtfully, his gaze steady. I get it. I think sometimes we need a change of scenery to really get a perspective on things. Sometimes it's about more than just the work. Maeve met his eyes, sensing there was something more to his words. She didn't know what it was yet, but she wasn't ready to open up to him, especially not here. Not now. I'm glad you're enjoying the retreat, Maeve said, standing up to leave. But I'm going to take a walk before we head back. Nice seeing you, Ryan. Ryan nodded with understanding. Take care, Maeve. See you around. As Maeve walked away, she realized that it wasn't Ryan she was avoiding. It was the discomfort of being confronted with someone who had been part of her past. It was still too fresh, too raw. But she also realized something important. She didn't need to carry that discomfort with her. She could move forward. She could choose what conversations and what people she allowed into her life. As Maeve walked along the lakeshore, the cool, crisp air brushing against her skin, she let her thoughts wander. The encounter with Ryan had been an unexpected reminder of how much her life had changed. But instead of feeling anxiety, a quiet sense of clarity settled over her. She had spent years building her life around Ethan, around the idea of us. Now, Maeve was learning what it meant to live for herself. She was beginning to understand that every moment, every decision, was part of her personal healing. She wasn't simply moving on, she was evolving, remaking herself in ways she never thought possible. Her thoughts were interrupted by a rustling sound behind her. Maeve turned to see Emily jogging towards her. Her face flushed with exertion but wearing a friendly smile. "Maeve! You disappeared on me," Emily called out, laughing breathlessly. "I thought we could walk together for a bit." Maeve's lips curled into a genuine smile. "Sorry, I just needed some time to think." Emily fell into step beside her. "I get it. Sometimes you just need to step away. Especially with all this forced team bonding going on." Maeve chuckled. "Yeah. I'm definitely not the most social right now." They walked in companionable silence for a while, the soothing sounds of the lake and the occasional bird call filling the space between them. As they passed a particularly scenic spot by the water, Emily suddenly spoke up. "So, I know you haven't been talking much about, well, everything that happened with Ethan, but I want you to know, I'm here for you, whenever you're ready." Maeve's stomach tightened slightly at the mention of Ethan's name. But it didn't feel like a weight, it was just a gentle reminder of her own healing process. She appreciated Emily's sensitivity, her careful way of approaching the subject. "I think I'm ready," Maeve said quietly, her voice steady but filled with a quiet vulnerability. "I'm just not sure how to start." "You know?" Emily nodded thoughtfully, her pace slowing. "Yeah. It's like, once you've been through something so huge, it feels like nothing will ever be the same. But, you know, not the same doesn't always mean bad. Sometimes it means better. Like, you can redefine everything you thought was solid, but you have to let go of the idea that it'll ever go back to how it was. That's what I've learned." Maeve looked at her, surprised by the depth of Emily's insight. "That's exactly how I feel. I thought I could just go back to being Maeve like I was before. But I can't. And it's scary. But I also feel like I'm opening up to something new. Something different." "Exactly," Emily agreed with a knowing smile. "It's like you're clearing out old, cluttered space and making room for something better. You just have to trust that it's coming." The two of them stopped by a bench, and Maeve sat down, grateful for Emily's presence. "Thank you," Maeve said softly. "I think I've been scared to let go. I've been holding on to this image of my life with Ethan, of what I thought it was supposed to be. It's hard to think of the future without that vision in mind. But I'm realizing that I don't have to be tied to it anymore." Emily sat next to her, her voice calm and supportive. "You don't. And that's the hardest part, learning to let go of something that defined you for so long. But Maeve, you're stronger than you think. You've been through so much. And you're still standing. You're not broken. You're just evolving." Maeve smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. It had been a long time since she'd felt this supported, this seen by someone other than Claire. She realized how important it was to have people around her who understood her, not just her pain, but her strength, her growth. Back at the resort, after the day's activities, Maeve found herself sitting on her balcony, watching the last rays of the sun dip below the horizon. Her thoughts were heavy with everything that had transpired, emotionally, professionally, and personally, but there was one more thing she knew she had to do. A conversation she couldn't avoid any longer. It was time to talk to her boss, Catherine. Over the past few months, Maeve had noticed her workload steadily increasing, especially since she had taken on a larger role in several projects. She had poured herself into her work as a way to cope with the aftermath of her personal life. But she was beginning to feel the strain. And the retreat had made her realize she couldn't continue like this. She needed to address her burnout before it consumed her. The next morning, after breakfast, Maeve found Catherine sitting in the lounge area. reviewing some notes for an upcoming meeting. She hesitated for a moment before approaching her. "Catherine, do you have a minute?" Maeve asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Catherine looked up and smiled warmly. "Of course. Maeve, what's on your mind?" Maeve took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about my workload. And I feel like I'm burning out. I've been taking on a lot of extra projects. And while I'm grateful for the opportunities, I think I need to step back and reevaluate how much I'm juggling right now." Catherine's expression shifted to one of understanding. "I appreciate you bringing this to me. We've noticed you've been putting in a lot of hours. Maeve, you've been handling everything with such professionalism. But I know burnout is real. And it's important that you take care of yourself." Maeve nodded, relieved to hear Catherine's response. "I think I need to be more mindful about finding balance. I don't want to let my work take over everything. Especially with everything that's happened personally. I need to make sure I'm not neglecting my well-being in the process." Catherine smiled kindly. "I understand completely. It's important to take a step back when you need it. You're one of our top performers, Maeve. And I want to make sure you're not sacrificing your health for success. We can adjust your workload to make sure you're not overburdened. Your well-being matters to us." Maeve felt a weight lift off her shoulders. "Thank you, Catherine. I really appreciate that." Catherine nodded. "Of course. And if there's anything you need from me, whether it's more time, fewer projects, or anything else, don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to support you." Maeve left the conversation feeling lighter, more confident in her ability to set boundaries and advocate for herself. It wasn't just about the work, this was about setting boundaries in every aspect of her life. It was a reminder that her well-being came first, no matter the external pressures. That evening, Maeve found herself sitting alone by the lake once again, her mind drifting back to Ethan. She hadn't expected to think about him so much during the retreat, but something about the stillness of the lake made her reflect on everything she had been through. In the quiet of the evening, it was easier to face the pain that had been so raw in the beginning. But now, it was no longer a wound that felt like it might consume her. It was a scar. Something that had shaped her, but not something that defined her. "I am not the woman I was when I first found out," Maeve thought to herself. "And that's okay. I don't need to be. I am becoming something better. Something stronger." She let the thought sit with her for a moment, savoring the peace that had begun to wash over her. As the last traces of daylight faded, Maeve realized that the future was still uncertain, but it was hers to shape. She had the power to decide who she was, where she was going, and how she would live. The horizon was wide open, and for the first time in a long while, Maeve felt ready to embrace whatever came next. Maeve stood at the window of her apartment, the city lights flickering below her like 1,000 tiny stars. The sky was a deep, velvety purple, and the air had a crisp bite to it, signaling that winter was creeping in. It had been several months since she returned from the retreat, and every day since had brought new revelations about herself and her place in the world. The transformation she had begun was no longer just a quiet internal process, it was taking shape in the actions she was now choosing. The path was still uncertain, but Maeve was no longer afraid of what the future might hold. For the first time in a long time, Maeve felt at peace with who she was. It had been hard, at first, to distance herself from the memories of her marriage. She still had moments when she felt the familiar tug of grief, when the weight of betrayal threatened to pull her under. But now, instead of shying away from those feelings, she acknowledged them. She let them wash over her without letting them dictate the course of her life. One evening, Maeve had gone through old photos and mementos from her time with Ethan. She sat quietly, going through the memories, but something had changed. The overwhelming sorrow she had once felt when looking at their pictures was gone. She had cried. She had raged. But now, there was only a quiet acknowledgement of the past, a recognition that it was over. And she had moved on. Maeve took one final look at the photo album. She closed it gently and placed it back on the shelf. "That part of my life is done," she whispered to herself, her voice steady. "And that's okay." The phone rang as Maeve sat at her kitchen table, sipping her morning coffee. She glanced at the caller ID and saw that it was Claire. Her heart warmed instantly. "Hey, Claire," Maeve answered, smiling. "You busy?" Claire asked, her voice light and teasing. "Not at all," Maeve replied. "What's up?" "I've been thinking," Claire said, her tone turning more serious. "There's an opportunity at work that I think you'd be perfect for. It's a new role they're opening up in our department, more leadership. A chance to make a bigger impact. It's exactly what you've been looking for." Maeve's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Wait. Really? What role?" Claire explained the details. And as Maeve listened, she felt a mix of excitement and uncertainty. The job sounded like a step up, a big one, and it would push her to use all the skills and knowledge she had gained in the years she'd worked there. But there was a catch. The role was high profile, which meant a higher level of visibility and more scrutiny from others. Maeve knew it would mean even more responsibility, more pressure to perform at a top tier. She also realized it could take her to new places, both personally and professionally. "I don't know, Claire," Maeve said, after a long pause. "It sounds amazing, but I'm not sure if I'm ready to throw myself back into that kind of pressure." "I get it," Claire said softly. "I know it's a lot to think about. But Maeve, you've grown so much. You're not the person you were when all of this started. You're stronger. You're more capable. And I think you should believe in yourself enough to take the leap." Maeve chewed her bottom lip, considering Claire's words. It was tempting, but the fear still lingered. She had been burned before. Would this new challenge burn her out too? "I don't want to take this opportunity unless I know I'm ready," Maeve admitted. "I don't want to throw myself into something I'm not prepared for." Claire was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to be perfect. But I do know that this could be the step you need. You've been healing, Maeve. And part of that healing is reclaiming your power. Stepping into a future that you choose. Not letting fear hold you back." Maeve exhaled, the weight of the decision heavy on her chest. But as she looked out at the city skyline, something in her shifted. She had spent so long rebuilding her life, she couldn't let fear hold her back now. It was time to take a chance. To embrace the unknown. "I'll do it," Maeve said, her voice steady with resolve. "I'm going to take the job." Facing Ethan one last time. It had been months since Maeve had last spoken to Ethan. After the confrontation with him in the hospital, they had gone their separate ways. They had exchanged a few texts. Some awkward, some formal, but nothing beyond that. Maeve had been careful not to indulge in the old patterns of codependency. They both needed space to heal. But now, as Maeve prepared for this new chapter, she realized that there was one last thing she needed to do. She needed to face Ethan. Not for closure, but for her own peace of mind. She didn't want him to have any more power over her emotions. She didn't want to carry around the bitterness of unfinished business. Maeve arranged to meet Ethan at a small cafe downtown. The same place they used to go when things were good. It felt oddly fitting. When she arrived, Ethan was already sitting at a table by the window, looking out at the passing cars. His face was a mixture of regret and sorrow as he glanced up at her. "Maeve," he said softly, "it's good to see you." She nodded but didn't sit right away. The last time they had been together, things had been tense, charged with anger, pain, and the weight of betrayal. But now, seeing him again, Maeve felt calm, almost detached. It wasn't a feeling of indifference, but rather a sign of how far she had come. "I'm not here to revisit the past," Maeve said, sitting down. "I just wanted to tell you that I'm okay. I'm really okay. I'm healing. I've been doing the work. And I'm not angry anymore." Ethan's eyes searched hers, as if he were looking for some trace of the woman who had once loved him without reservation. He seemed to search for the woman who still carried the pain, the betrayal, and the memories. "I never meant to hurt you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I know," Maeve replied, "but the truth is, Ethan, I've spent too much time trying to understand you, trying to forgive you. I've spent too much time trying to hold onto the past, and I just can't anymore. I'm not that woman anymore." She paused for a moment, letting the words sink in, before continuing. "I forgive you, but that doesn't mean I'm going back. It means I'm moving forward. I'm building a life without you in it. And that's the most powerful thing I can do for myself. Ethan looked down, nodding slowly, his face a mixture of guilt and sadness. But Maeve wasn't affected by it. Not anymore. This was her moment. The moment she stopped looking back and started moving forward with the life she had worked so hard to rebuild. Goodbye, Ethan, Maeve said quietly, standing up. Ethan didn't try to stop her. He simply nodded, the tears in his eyes saying everything that words could not. Maeve walked out of the cafe, the door closing softly behind her. A new chapter begins. Maeve's first day in her new role felt exhilarating. The transition from the retreat to the office had been a bit jarring, but it was exactly what she needed. The job was demanding, but she felt energized rather than drained. The challenges were no longer insurmountable obstacles but opportunities for growth. And best of all, she was in control. As Maeve looked out over the city from her office window, she realized that the woman she had been, the woman who had felt broken, betrayed, and unsure, was gone. She wasn't the same person. She wasn't defined by Ethan's betrayal. She was defined by her resilience, her ability to rise after every fall, and the courage to build a future on her own terms. Maeve smiled to herself. This was only the beginning. The best was yet to come.